Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Ann Wilson, and I will unfortunately be presenting today by video. I also want to start by acknowledging my wonderful PhD student, Victoria Parker, who's truly the lead on this project and is also definitely responsible for any of the slides that you think look nice. So if you're in this symposium, it's unlikely I have to convince you that cross-party hostility is on the rise. It may be less evident to you, though, that this is actually a problem. So let me put this dislike in context. Many of us know the dangerous potential in humans' capacity to dehumanize outgroups. We recoil at the language comparing ethnic groups to vermin or animals and express rightful concern at findings like these. Muslims, Arabs, and Mexican immigrants are dehumanized relative to average Americans on this blatant dehumanization scale. However, many of us may barely pause at the same language used to describe political opponents. And a recent study found that Republicans and Democrats dehumanize their political opponents at actually 2 to 3 times the rate as these other ethnic groups. Now, this does give me pause. I also want to start with a clear distinction between warranted and miscalibrated contempt. So after all, vigorous disagreement is an important part of a functioning democracy. We don't want to get rid of that. But what appears to be happening is that clear-eyed policy disagreement and well-calibrated dislike even has come to be replaced with this outrage-fueled hostility that can really cloud our capacity to distinguish major differences from minor ones. It can really stymie our efforts to move forward on important social problems. So what accounts for this plummeting regard for the other side? So although the polarizing of actual attitudes can play some role, so it is going up over time, it appears that the imagined attitudes or perceived polarization between sides is starker still and seems to actually account for more of this dislike. There's actually mounting evidence that opponents in our heads are quite different from the opponents on the ground. So in our own past work, we find that partisans don't misjudge all issues. They're actually fairly accurate at judging, for example, the opponents' attitudes towards standard issues like healthcare and tax cuts. If anything, they slightly underestimate how extreme their opponents are. But where we do find major misconceptions is in the prevalence of the fringe, the even caricatured kinds of issues that we often see in the culture war. So liberals vastly overestimate the percentage of deplorable conservatives that endorse racism, and conservatives vastly overestimate the number of liberals who are snowflakes and want to do away with free speech. We find that it's this dramatic overestimation of extreme caricatures that predicts dislike, not our perception of these more standard policy issues. In turn, this dislike predicts unwillingness to even engage with opponents. And this, of course, forecloses an opportunity to correct these misconceptions. We also find that people report being less inclined to publicly voice their own opinions about extreme own side issues. Since most people's actual views are more moderate than these misconceptions, this muting also then limits the process of correction because in-group members who dissent from the fringe may be staying out of public discussion. So where are people getting these misplaced ideas about their opponents? We argue that they don't just appear, they're shaped by increasingly polarized institutions, including political elites, media, and social media. So in our earlier work, we examined how consumption of partisan media predicts misconceptions of these fringe issues. And we suspect this is because this kind of media is especially likely to over-report these rare but unflattering stories that reinforce these partisan stereotypes. However, another important institutional factor is social media. And there are a number of converging reasons that social media may reinforce extreme misconceptions. So first, it turns out that many of the most ideologically extreme people are frequent social media users. Go figure. They're likely disproportionately sharing these extreme opinions that don't necessarily reflect the rest of their in-groups. and outrage attracts eyeballs. So algorithms that optimize for attention may also help to make these riveting fringe views more visible. And we're not passive consumers in all this outrage either, right? So we're active participants in what gets amplified and shared. We know, for instance, that moral, emotional statements are more shared than others. These often reflect outrage. Angry characterizations of political outgroups are also especially likely to go viral. So practically, this may translate to more extreme views being amplified the most, skewing perceptions of how prevalent those opinions are within the group. So that's the logic that underlies the work I want to tell you about today. What's the power of a single extreme tweet to shape perceptions of intergroup attitudes? In our pilot work, we are seeing that even a single fringe tweet tends to increase opponents' prevalence estimates of what the outgroup thinks from their already fairly high baseline by about 10%. So one tweet is 10%, let's say. I also want to just note one other line of research where we're finding some evidence that these noxious tweets can matter for other socially important reasons. So for example, we pair these kinds of obnoxious tweets, which people are randomly assigned sometimes to see first, with public health information provided about COVID-19. And we find that conservatives exposed to just a single obnoxious liberal tweet actually then ended up reducing their willingness to accept or act on scientifically valid COVID advice from a completely different Democrat. So if a single tweet matters, how could we use this insight to mitigate instead of amplify misconceptions about what groups stand for? So if morally outrageous ideas are especially amplified, it might also discourage the more moderate views from publicly voicing their opinion. The finding I mentioned earlier is also described in a lot of cool detail in Chris Bale's really interesting book, documenting how moderates are also muted in many ways online. So it makes sense that moderates may sometimes self-censor, especially if fringe views seem so prevalent. Pluralistic ignorance might convince these dissenters that they are in a minority when they're not. Moderates might also want to show loyalty to their groups, especially when they really hate their opponents. But dissent can be helpful for a group. In-group dissenters provide an important course correction against group norms that they perceive as harmful. But here we also argue that dissenters serve another important impression management function. So if moderates publicly dissent, it can correct misperceptions that others have about group extremity. And this is really what we want to test here, the effective dissent on outgroup perceptions of group attitudes. So the logic of these studies is pretty straightforward. We create and expose people to extreme view tweets about things, in this case, things that are racist or anti-free speech. And then we ask people to estimate the percentage of liberals and conservatives who at least somewhat agree with those tweets. We can compare that to the percentage of liberals and conservatives who actually agree by looking at how many of those groups actually somewhat agree or higher on these tweets. Okay, so that is the basic way that we look at these questions. So for example, in this study, people who are exposed to an extreme liberal tweet, we find that about 39% of liberals actually do agree with this, so a little higher than some of our other studies. But conservatives dramatically overestimate the number of liberals who agree with it. So they think that 65% do. So that's just the basic baseline conditions. Now, what about if they're exposed to additional social media information? So in this study, we expose some people to an additional tweet that agrees with the first one and other people to an additional tweet that dissents from the first one. People who see another in-group member agreeing actually increase their prevalence estimates just a little bit. But what's key here is that people who are exposed to even a single dissenter significantly drop their prevalence estimates of the outgroup. Okay, so it does appear that even a single tweet can, dissenting tweet can drop those estimates. This is the same thing, but for the conservative groups, and we find exactly the same pattern. So relatively few conservatives agree with this tweet. Liberals believe that a majority of conservatives agreed with it. And here, what's key is that when they're exposed to a single conservative who dissents, they drop their estimates of conservatives considerably. So for sake of time, I'm not going to talk about each of the Twitter dissenter studies individually, but rather give you some of the highlights. So we've got 5 studies so far in this package. And there are some limitations to individual studies. We look at single issues. You probably noticed some of the issues are ones that are debatable, and especially in unstable political times, you get some bouncing around about attitudes. However, what we find that are signals across all of the studies I want to tell you about. So first, we find that consent is stronger than conformity, or sorry, dissent is stronger than conformity. So what that means is that a single disagree tweet weighs more or has more influence than a single agree tweet. We also find that exposure to multiple dissenters is stronger than exposure to a single dissenter. So in some studies, we give people a little bit of a dog pile here. So we've got a number of people who all come and do some in-group dissenting. And this actually results in up to a 25% reduction in these incorrect prevalence estimates compared to a smaller reduction between 0 and 12% in various studies for a single dissenting tweet. We're also finding that liberals are more likely to change their mind about conservatives than the reverse. And this is something that we're continuing to try to understand more fully. And finally, that conservatives are influenced more by uncivil and forceful liberal dissenters than by more polite ones. And again, this is something that I'll throw out there that we don't completely understand yet, but are interested in understanding more. Finally, the other thing to highlight is that exposure to dissent in the moment doesn't directly reduce partisan animosity. So in all of these studies, the causal effect is on estimated prevalence. And then estimated prevalence in turn predicts lower feelings of animosity towards opponents and more willingness to engage with them. All right, so to close, what I've tried to do is to present a snapshot of how exposure to social media extremes might contribute to our incorrectly polarized views and fuel animosity. And it's not that these fringe people don't exist at all, but they really do exist in smaller numbers than we suppose. We also try to present a snapshot here of how unmuting more moderate dissenting in-group views online might help to recalibrate our views of opponents as less extreme and more varied than we often assume. So the changes are in some cases small, and our low-tech experimentation, one tweet at a time, only scratches the surface of how social media operates at scale. But it does point to the relevance of considering these institutional sources of polarization and how we might envision different norms for interaction online. So right now, constructive, moderate, dissenting views are muted online. Not only do people hesitate to voice these views, but they are less likely to be shared and boosted by algorithms. So I'll end with a question to consider. What would social media dynamics look like if it was dissent, constructive disagreement, and intellectual humility that was amplified instead? And I will close with that. And I emphasize again, if you can't end up asking me questions during the talk, that I will be standing by email and happy to engage with anybody at any point. So thanks very much.